The early morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Michael Torres pulled into his assigned spot at Pine Ridge Apartments. His hands gripped the steering wheel of his 1967 Mustang a moment longer than necessary, savoring the familiar rumble of the engine before turning the key. The car had been his father's pride and joy, a classic beauty with deep blue paint that seemed to change color in different light. 3 tours overseas had changed Michael in ways most people couldn't understand. At 32, the lines around his eyes told stories of things he'd seen, things he couldn't forget even when he wanted to. Coming home should have felt like a victory, but most days it just felt like trading one battlefield for another. "Nice ride," called Mrs. Wu from her first-floor balcony, where she watered her collection of potted herbs. She was in her 70s and always had a kind word for everyone. "Your dad would be proud you kept it running so nice." Michael nodded and managed a small smile. Mrs. Wu had known his father. They'd been neighbors long before Michael was deployed. She was one of the few connections to his past life that remained unchanged. "Thanks. Got the carburetor working better now?" "Not making that knocking sound anymore," he replied, running his hand along the hood. The cool metal under his palm felt real, grounding. Some days, touching things was the only way to remind himself he was really here and not still back there. The Mustang was more than transportation. When Michael had received the news of his father's heart attack during his second tour, he couldn't come home for the funeral. By the time he returned stateside, his childhood home had been sold to cover medical bills, and most of his father's possessions were gone. But his dad's best friend Tom had saved the Mustang, keeping it in his garage for years until Michael came back. "He made me promise," Tom had said, handing over the keys 4 months ago. "Said this car was waiting for you to come home." Michael popped the trunk and pulled out his duffel bag. Inside the apartment, everything was still in boxes, even though he'd been here for nearly 3 months. Getting settled meant admitting this was home now, and he wasn't quite ready for that. The only space that looked lived in was the small corner by the window where he'd set up a workbench with car manuals and parts catalogs. Every Saturday morning, Michael would take the Mustang for a drive along the coast, the windows down and the radio playing his dad's old cassette tapes, Bruce Springsteen, Tom Petty, and the Eagles. During those drives, the nightmares and the ringing in his ears from too many explosions would fade just enough to let him breathe. Last week, he'd even started attending the Veterans Support Group at the community center. He hadn't said much, just listened as others shared stories that sounded too familiar. The sleepless nights, the startled reactions to loud noises, the feeling of being a stranger in your own hometown. "First step's the hardest," said Ray, an older Vietnam vet who ran the group. "Just showing up takes guts." Today marked 90 days back on American soil, and Michael had finally unpacked the shadow box containing his medals and his father's service photo from Vietnam. He placed it on the wall, the only decoration in his sparse living room. The apartment manager had mentioned that some neighbors had complained about his reserved parking spot. Apparently, the family in 3B thought it should go to them since they had more cars. Michael didn't care much about apartment politics, but that parking spot was in his lease, and the Mustang needed to be somewhere safe. As the sun set that evening, Michael sat on his small balcony with a cup of coffee, watching his car in the parking lot below. In the fading light, it looked just like it had when his father would take him for Sunday drives. For the first time since coming home, he allowed himself to think maybe, just maybe, he could build something here. Not the life he'd left behind, but something new. Something that honored both the man he'd been and the one he was becoming. He couldn't know then that by tomorrow night, everything would change. The Hamilton family moved into Pine Ridge Apartments 6 months before Michael arrived, and it hadn't taken long for everyone in the building to learn their names. Their arrival was marked by a moving day that blocked the entire parking lot for hours because Greg Hamilton insisted the moving truck needed to take up 4 spaces instead of using the loading zone. "Rules are for people without options," Greg liked to say with a wink that suggested he always had options. At 45, he wore expensive watches and drove a luxury SUV that he often parked diagonally across 2 spaces to protect the paint job. His wife Lisa spent most mornings power walking around the complex in designer workout clothes, loudly talking on her phone about people who weren't living up to their potential. Their teenage kids, Amber and Tyler, had become the neighborhood nuisance. 16-year-old Tyler had a modified sports car with an exhaust so loud it set off car alarms, while 15-year-old Amber hosted pool parties that took over the community area without reservation. The apartment manager had given them warnings, but nothing ever changed. They think money buys them the right to do whatever they want, Mrs. Wu told Michael one evening as they'd both watched Tyler doing donuts in the parking lot. Fourth family they've scared away this year. The Patols left last month after their daughter's bike was thrown in the dumpster. The Hamiltons had a particular way of targeting anyone who stood up to them. When Mr. Rivera from 2C complained about the noise from their weekend parties, his doormat disappeared, his newspaper delivery went missing for weeks, and somehow his car alarm would go off randomly at 3 a.m. He moved out within a month. Lisa Hamilton had first noticed Michael's Mustang on a Tuesday afternoon. She was sitting on her balcony when he pulled into his reserved spot, the one closest to the building entrance besides the handicap spaces. That spot should really be for residents who've been here longer, she mentioned loudly to her husband that evening while Michael was washing the Mustang. Military or not, seniority should count for something. Michael had pretended not to hear, but he felt her eyes on him every time he came or went. The next day, a printed note appeared on his windshield. "Wouldn't your car be safer in the back row?" It wasn't signed, but he recognized the same fancy paper Lisa used for the community board notices she was always posting. The following week, Greg approached Michael directly while he was checking his mail. "Hey buddy, I wanted to talk to you about that parking situation," Greg said, clapping a hand on Michael's shoulder. Michael flinched at the unexpected contact. "My wife has these grocery deliveries, and that spot would be really convenient for us. I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone." "The spot came with my lease," Michael replied quietly. "I need it for my car." Greg's friendly smile tightened. "Look, I get that you're attached to that old thing, but we've got 2 cars and teenagers learning to drive. Surely there's something we can offer to make it worth your while." "It's not for sale or trade," Michael said. "Sorry." The conversation ended there, but the tension had just begun. That night, the Hamiltons' weekly gathering spilled out onto the balcony directly above Michael's apartment. Laughter and music kept him awake until 2 a.m., and when he finally fell asleep, he was jolted awake by what sounded like furniture being dragged across their floor. At the community mailboxes the next day, Michael overheard Lisa talking to another neighbor. "Some people don't understand community give and take," she was saying, "especially those who've been in environments where they just follow orders. They don't know how to function in normal society where we negotiate and compromise." Tyler started revving his engine whenever he saw Michael in the parking lot. Amber and her friends would fall suddenly silent when he walked past the pool, then burst into laughter after he passed. Small things, nothing worth reporting, but the message was clear. The Hamiltons weren't used to hearing no. What Michael didn't know was that Greg Hamilton had already complained to the property manager 3 times about the veteran getting preferential treatment. Each time, the manager explained that assigned parking was part of the lease agreement and couldn't be changed without Michael's consent. Then find a reason to break his lease, Greg had suggested during his last visit to the office. There must be something he's doing wrong. The Hamiltons were used to getting their way. They just needed to wait for the right opportunity. The veteran support group had run late that Thursday evening. Michael sat in a circle with 8 other vets, listening as a young woman who'd served as a medic talked about the nightmares that still woke her up screaming. Her words hit close to home, and for the first time, Michael raised his hand and shared too, just a little, about how the smell of certain foods or the sound of a car backfiring could send him right back to the worst day of his tour. "That's good work today," Ray told him as they walked to the parking lot around 9 p.m., talking about it takes the power away from it, little by little. Michael nodded, feeling strangely lighter despite the heaviness of the conversation. "Same time next week." "We'll be here," Ray replied, giving him a firm handshake. "Drive safe." The drive back to Pine Ridge was peaceful, stars visible in patches between the clouds. Michael even stopped for a burger at the drive-thru, something he rarely did. Small steps toward normal, he thought. Maybe all those therapy sessions were finally starting to help. The apartment complex was unusually quiet when he pulled in. Most of the windows were dark, though music drifted from the pool area where a few residents often gathered on warmer evenings. Michael circled toward his parking spot, noticing that someone had turned off the lights in that section of the lot. He'd have to mention it to maintenance tomorrow. He slowed the car, squinting through the darkness, then slammed on the brakes. Something wasn't right. His spot was empty, but... Michael jumped out of the car, leaving the headlights on to illuminate the scene. His heart hammered against his ribs as he walked forward. His father's Mustang was there, but it wasn't the same car he polished just that morning. All 4 tires were slashed, the rubber hanging in ribbons from the rims. The deep blue paint was crossed with jagged scratches that spelled out words that made his stomach turn. Loser. Go away. The windshield was a spiderweb of cracks, and something dark and sticky had been poured over the hood. No, 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 Michael whispered, his voice catching as he circled the car. His hands hovered over the damage, afraid to touch anything. The car looked wounded, violated. His vision blurred with tears that he quickly wiped away. A sound made him look up. From their 3rd-floor balcony, he could see the Hamiltons watching. Lisa was holding a glass of wine, leaning against the railing. Greg stood behind her, his arm around her waist. They didn't look surprised or concerned. They looked satisfied. "Hey, buddy, everything okay down there?" Greg called, his voice carrying an edge of mockery. Before Michael could respond, another neighbor's porch light flipped on. Mrs. Wu stepped outside in her bathrobe, a phone already pressed to her ear. "I'm calling the police," she announced loudly. "Someone vandalized Michael's car." Other lights began to turn on. Doors opened. Neighbors in pajamas and sweatpants emerged onto balconies and walkways. "Who would do something like this?" asked Mr. Patel from 2B, shaking his head in disgust. "I think I might know," said a voice from the 2nd floor. It was Jenny Chen, a college student who lived directly below the Hamiltons. She held up her phone. "My doorbell camera might have caught something. I installed it after my bike was stolen last month." Michael barely heard the conversation swirling around him. He sank to his knees beside the car, one hand finally reaching out to touch the door handle, the only part that seemed undamaged. The cool metal brought him back to reality. Just a car, he tried to tell himself. Just metal and paint. But it wasn't just a car. It was his father's voice saying, "Take care of her, son," the last time they talked on a crackling phone line from halfway around the world. It was Sunday drives and the smell of leather conditioner and the one piece of home he had left. Someone draped a jacket over his shoulders. Mrs. Wu stood beside him, her hand gentle on his back. "The police are coming," she said softly, "and look around. You're not alone." Michael looked up through the blur of tears he couldn't hold back anymore. The parking lot had filled with people, neighbors he'd barely spoken to, some still in pajamas, others in work uniforms. They formed a protective circle around him and the damaged Mustang. From their balcony, the Hamiltons had disappeared inside, their curtains now drawn. But it was too late. Something had shifted in the quiet night air of Pine Ridge Apartments. The damage was done, but so was their anonymity. By morning, the story of Michael's vandalized Mustang had spread beyond Pine Ridge Apartments. 2 police officers had taken statements and photographs until well past midnight, carefully documenting every scratch, every slash, every vile word carved into the paint. They'd been especially interested in Jenny Chen's doorbell camera footage, which showed Tyler Hamilton and 3 other teenagers circling the car with keys and knives while Amber kept watch. Most stunning of all, the video captured Greg and Lisa Hamilton, clearly visible on their balcony, watching the whole thing. "We'll need to download this footage as evidence," Officer Rodriguez had told Jenny. "This is serious criminal damage, and with the targeted nature of the vandalism against a veteran, there could be additional charges." Michael had barely slept that night. The police had arranged for the Mustang to be towed to the impound lot for evidence processing, and watching it being loaded onto the flapped, damaged, and broken felt like losing his father all over again. Morning brought a knock on his door. Mrs. Wu stood there with a thermos of coffee and Mr. Patel from 2B beside her. "You should see this," Mr. Patel said, holding up his phone. "My daughter put the story online last night." Michael took the phone and scrolled through a social media post that already had thousands of shares. Nisha Patel worked for the local news station as a junior reporter, and her post was professional and pointed. "Decorated veteran targeted by family with history of harassment at local apartment complex. 3 tours serving our country, only to come home to this." The post included a tastefully edited photo of the damage that focused on the slashed tires without showing the hateful words. It also mentioned that the Mustang had belonged to Michael's father, also a veteran, who had passed away while Michael was deployed. "I hope that's okay," Mr. Patel said, looking concerned. Nisha was very upset when she saw what happened. She wanted people to know. Before Michael could answer, his phone buzzed with a text from Ray, his group leader. "Saw the news. The guys and I are coming over. No arguments." "People want to help," Mrs. Wu said gently. "Let them." By noon, the parking lot had become an impromptu gathering place. Ray had arrived with 5 other veterans from the support group. The owner of the local coffee shop showed up with sandwiches and drinks. Nisha Patel was there with a cameraman, interviewing neighbors about the Hamiltons' history of entitlement and harassment. "They've made life miserable for everyone who wouldn't bow to their demands," Jenny Chen explained on camera. But this crossed a line. That car was Michael's connection to his dad. Michael sat quietly on a bench, overwhelmed by the support but still feeling hollow inside. A man in coveralls approached, introducing himself as Dave from Classics Auto Restoration. "My brother served with the 10th Mountain," Dave said, handing Michael a business card. "When we heard about this, we had a shop meeting. We want to restore your Mustang, no charge." "That would cost thousands," Michael replied, stunned. "I can't accept that." Dave shook his head firmly. "It's not charity, it's respect. Your dad's car deserves to be brought back right, and we've got the skills to do it. Plus," he added with a small smile, "it would be good publicity for the shop." By mid-afternoon, someone had started a GoFundMe page titled "Restore a Hero's Heritage." The initial goal was $5,000 to cover parts that the shop might need to source. It hit that target within 3 hours and kept climbing. Michael watched in disbelief as his phone notifications wouldn't stop. Old army buddies were messaging him. Former classmates he hadn't spoken to in years were sharing the story. The local VFW post called to offer support. The American Legion invited him to be a guest at their next meeting. Meanwhile, the Hamiltons had not emerged from their apartment all day. Delivery drivers were turned away at the door. The curtains remained closed. Once Tyler's face appeared briefly at the window, looking down at the gathering in the parking lot, before quickly disappearing again. They didn't expect this, Ray told Michael as they watched more people arrive with food and support. "People like that think everyone's as selfish as they are. They never count on community." That evening, the apartment manager called an emergency community meeting in the clubhouse. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls. Michael sat near the back, still processing the day's events, as the manager announced that security cameras would be installed in the parking lot immediately, paid for by the management company. "We've also consulted our legal team," she continued, her voice firm. "The lease agreement includes provisions against harassment and criminal activity. We've begun formal eviction proceedings against the Hamilton family." The room erupted in applause. Someone patted Michael on the shoulder. For the first time since seeing his vandalized car, he felt something other than loss. It wasn't quite hope yet, but it was the knowledge that he wasn't facing this alone. Outside the clubhouse, as the meeting dispersed, Nisha Patel approached him with her camera crew. "Would you be willing to share your story? People need to hear it from you." Michael hesitated, then nodded. His father had always told him that silence only protects the wrong people. "Yes," he said quietly. "It's time to speak up." The Hamilton family finally emerged from their apartment 3 days after the vandalism, only to find 2 police officers waiting with arrest warrants. The scene played out in front of dozens of neighbors who happened to be checking their mail or walking their dogs at exactly the right moment. Great Hamilton wore his usual confident smile as he approached the officers. "There must be some misunderstanding. We're law-abiding citizens. Sir, we have warrants for the arrest of you, your wife, and your son Tyler on charges of criminal mischief, conspiracy, and property damage," Officer Rodriguez stated firmly. "Your daughter Amber will need to come to the station with a parent for questioning as a juvenile." Lisa Hamilton's face turned pale. "This is ridiculous. We didn't touch that old car." "Ma'am, we'd have video evidence showing your son and his friends vandalizing the vehicle while you and your husband watched from your balcony," the second officer explained. "The district attorney has reviewed the footage and approved these charges." As the officers led Greg and Tyler to separate police cars in handcuffs, Lisa followed behind with Amber, her designer purse clutched tightly against her chest. The confident swagger that had defined the Hamilton family was nowhere to be seen. That afternoon, Michael sat in the district attorney's office, a place he never expected to find himself. The walls were lined with law books, and family photos sat on the desk of District Attorney Wilson, a serious woman in her 50s with reading glasses perched on her nose. "The evidence is strong," she explained to Michael. "The video footage clearly shows the teens committing the vandalism while the parents watched. We've also collected statements from 12 neighbors documenting a pattern of harassment towards you specifically after you refused to give up your parking space." "What happens now?" Michael asked quietly. "Tyler will be charged as an adult due to the severity of the damage and the targeted nature of the crime. The parents are being charged with conspiracy and contributing to the delinquency of minors. There's also the possibility of additional charges related to targeting a veteran, which could be classified as a hate crime under state law." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I just want my car fixed and to be left alone." DA Wilson nodded understanding. "The criminal justice system has to take its course, but there are other options for making you whole. We can pursue restitution as part of any plea agreement or conviction, which would require them to pay for damages." As Michael left the courthouse, he found Ray waiting for him on the steps. "How'd it go?" Ray asked, falling into step beside him. "They're facing serious charges. The kids who helped Tyler are being charged too," Michael explained. "Feels strange seeing the system actually work." Ray nodded. "Justice doesn't always show up, but when it does, it's something to see." That evening, Michael's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. It was a lawyer representing the Hamilton family. "Mr. Torres, my clients would like to discuss a settlement," the lawyer began smoothly. "They're prepared to pay for the repairs to your vehicle in exchange for dropping the charges." Michael's grip tightened on the phone. "The charges aren't mine to drop. This is a criminal case. Perhaps you could put in a good word with the DA? Mention that you've been compensated and don't wish to pursue the matter." Michael thought about Tyler's face as he slashed the tires. About Greg and Lisa watching from their balcony, wine glasses in hand. About all the neighbors who had been bullied and harassed before him. "No," he said simply. "I won't do that. Mr. Torres, please be reasonable. The Hamiltons are respected members of the community. Greg is on the board of several local businesses. Their children's futures are at stake. Surely we can come to some arrangement." "There's nothing to arrange," Michael replied. "They made choices. Now they face consequences." The next week brought the preliminary hearing. The courtroom was packed with Pine Ridge residents. The Hamiltons had hired an expensive defense attorney who argued passionately that the video evidence should be excluded because it was recorded without his client's knowledge. Judge Thompson, a veteran herself, was unimpressed. The recording was made in a public area where there is no expectation of privacy. The motion to exclude is denied. When Tyler took the stand, gone was the arrogant teenager who had revved his engine to annoy neighbors. In his place sat a scared young man in an ill-fitting suit. "It was just supposed to be a prank," he mumbled. "Dad said Mr. Torres needed to learn to get along with people." The courtroom fell silent. Greg Hamilton's face reddened with anger as his son continued. "Mom and Dad said they were tired of asking nicely. They said sometimes you have to send a message. They didn't tell us exactly what to do, but they said they'd be watching from the balcony and to make sure Mr. Torres got the point about the parking space." The defense attorney tried to object, but the damage was done. The Hamiltons' carefully constructed story of being innocent bystanders was crumbling under oath. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with cameras. Michael slipped out a side entrance, not wanting to be part of the media circus. But as he walked to his car, a thought struck him that brought the first genuine smile to his face in weeks. Sometimes justice didn't need grand gestures or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it simply needed the truth to come to light. As he drove away, his phone buzzed with a message from Dave at the auto shop. "Got the original paint color matched perfectly. Your dad's Mustang is coming back better than ever. Justice is sweet, but restoration is sweeter." Dave's auto shop sat on the corner of Main and Pine, a brick building with faded signs and 3 garage bays that had served the community for over 30 years. To most people driving past, it might have looked ordinary. But for Michael, walking through those doors 6 weeks after the vandalism felt like stepping into a place of healing. "There he is," Dave called out from under the hood of a pickup truck. He wiped his hands on a rag and gestured for Michael to follow him. "Got something to show you." Michael had visited the shop a few times since they'd taken in his father's Mustang, but Dave had been mysterious about the progress, keeping the car under covers and saying he wanted the reveal to be a surprise. Today was finally the day Michael would see what they'd accomplished. "Before we go back there," Dave said, stopping at the front counter, "I want to show you something else." He pulled out a thick folder. "These are all the people who've contributed to the restoration." Michael flipped through pages of names, some he recognized from Pine Ridge Apartments, others complete strangers. Notes accompanied many of the donations. "Thank you for your service. My father was in Vietnam too. No one should have their memories vandalized." The GoFundMe hit $22,000, Dave explained. "We only needed about $7,000 for parts. The rest is going into some special editions we thought you might appreciate." "I don't know what to say," Michael managed, his throat tight. "Don't say anything yet," Dave grinned. "Wait till you see her." Dave led him through the shop, past mechanics who nodded in greeting, to the back bay where a large shape sat under a blue tarp. A small crowd had gathered: Dave's crew, Raid from the Veterans Group, Mrs. Wu and several other neighbors, and Nisha Patel with her camera. "Hope you don't mind the audience," Dave said. "Everyone wanted to be here." Michael nodded, suddenly nervous. The Mustang had been in terrible shape: slashed tires, kite paint, broken glass. Part of him was afraid to see what remained of his father's legacy. "All right, everyone," Dave announced. "The moment we've been waiting for." 2 mechanics pulled away the tarp, and for a second, Michael couldn't believe what he was seeing. The 1967 Mustang gleamed under the shop lights, its deep blue paint so perfect it looked like it had just rolled off the factory floor. The windows were crystal clear, the chrome trim polished to a mirror shine. The tires were new, the wheels restored to their original glory. "Go on," Dave urged. "Take a closer look." Michael circled the car slowly, running his fingers lightly over the surface where hateful words had once been carved. Now there was only smooth, flawless paint. The interior had been completely restored as well, the leather seats reconditioned, the dashboard polished, the gauges cleaned and calibrated. "We matched the original paint code exactly," explained Lou, Dave's paint specialist. "Had to call in some favors from a restoration specialist in Detroit, but we got it right. The upholstery is new, but we kept the original pattern," added Tim, who handled interiors. "And we found this under the driver's seat." He handed Michael a faded gas station receipt from 1985, signed with his father's distinctive handwriting. "Thought you might want to keep it." Michael carefully took the receipt, a tiny piece of his father's life preserved against all odds. "Thank you," he whispered. "That's not all," Dave said with a grin. "Pop the hood." Michael released the latch and lifted the hood to find an engine bay so clean you could eat off it. The original V8 had been completely rebuilt, parts restored or replaced where necessary, everything tuned to perfection. "We kept it period correct," Dave explained. "But we added a few modern touches that won't change the look or feel." He pointed out subtle upgrades to the ignition system, brakes, and cooling that would make the car more reliable without sacrificing its classic nature. "And one more thing," Dave said, handing Michael a small box. Inside was a key ring with the Mustang logo and a purple heart charm. "We'd had this made special. The new keys are on it, along with something to remember your service." Ray stepped forward then, holding something in his hands. The guys at the VFW wanted to add this. It was a small metal plate, engraved with Michael's father's name and service dates, along with Michael's own. "We thought it could go on the dash. A reminder of who this car really belongs to." Cameras clicked as Michael stood silent, overwhelmed by the generosity around him. The car wasn't just restored, it was reborn, better than it had been before. What the Hamiltons had tried to destroy had instead brought together an entire community. Mrs. Wu handed Michael a handkerchief, and he realized there were tears on his face. "Your father would be proud," she said softly, "not just of the car, but of how you've handled everything." "Want to take her for a spin?" Dave asked, offering the new keys. Michael slid behind the wheel, the familiar contours of the seat welcoming him home. The engine started with a deep, healthy rumble that he felt in his chest. It sounded like his childhood, like his father's laugh, like coming home. As he pulled out of the garage, neighbors and veterans and strangers who had become friends applauded. Michael drove slowly around the block, feeling the smooth power of the engine, the precise handling of the wheel. The Mustang wasn't just transportation, it was a symbol of everything that could be repaired, rebuilt, restored. When he returned to the shop, Nisha approached with her microphone. "How does it feel to have your father's car back?" she asked. Michael looked at the gleaming Mustang, then at the crowd of people who had made it possible. "It feels like more than just a car now," he said. "It feels like proof that the good in people will always overcome the bad." 3 months after the night of the vandalism, Michael sat in the back row of the courtroom, watching as the Hamilton family stood for sentencing. The trial had been shorter than expected. With the video evidence and Tyler's damning testimony, the prosecution had built an airtight case. Greg Hamilton wore an expensive suit that couldn't hide his fallen expression. Lisa stood beside him, her designer outfit replaced by something understated and appropriate for court. Tyler stood slightly apart from his parents, looking younger than his 16 years in a button-up shirt that seemed too big for his frame. In the matter of the state versus Hamilton, Judge Thompson began, her voice firm but not unkind. "This court has found the defendants guilty of criminal mischief, conspiracy, and property damage. In the case of the minor defendant Tyler Hamilton, the court has taken his age and his cooperation into account." Michael listened as the judge detailed the sentences. Greg and Lisa Hamilton received substantial fines, 2 years of probation, and 200 hours of community service each at the local VA hospital. Tyler was sentenced to juvenile probation, mandatory counseling, and 100 hours of community service at a Veterans Outreach Center. Additionally, the judge continued, "This court orders full restitution in the amount of $7,246 for the damage to Mr. Torres's vehicle to be paid immediately." She looked directly at the Hamiltons. "The court also requires each of you to write letters of apology to Mr. Torres and to the community of Pine Ridge Apartments." After the sentencing, Michael slipped out a side door, avoiding the reporters gathered outside. He found Ray waiting for him in the parking lot. "Justice served?" Ray asked as they walked to where the restored Mustang gleamed in the sunlight. Michael considered the question. "I think so. Not about punishment, really. About consequences and maybe learning something." Speaking of learning, Ray said, "The coordinator at the Veterans Center called. They're excited about Tyler starting his community service next week." Michael nodded. After much thought, he had agreed to help supervise some of Tyler's service hours. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but something close to it, a belief that people could change if given the right guidance. 2 weeks later, Michael drove the Mustang to Pine Ridge Apartments for the last time. His apartment was packed up, boxes stacked neatly by the door. He was moving to a small house on the edge of town, a place with a garage for the Mustang and a yard where he thought he might plant a garden. Mrs. Wu and several neighbors had organized a small goodbye gathering in the courtyard. The atmosphere was bittersweet. They were sad to see him go, but understood his desire for a fresh start. "You'll come back and visit?" Mrs. Wu asked, pressing a container of homemade cookies into his hands. "Of course," Michael promised. "And you all have my new address for the housewarming next month." As the gathering wound down, a car pulled up at the edge of the parking lot. Greg Hamilton stepped out alone. He hesitated, then walked toward the group. The neighbors fell silent, watching warily. "Mr. Torres," Greg said, stopping a respectful distance away. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Michael nodded and stepped aside with him. "I came to apologize in person," Greg said, his voice lacking its former arrogance. "The court-ordered letter doesn't seem enough." Michael said nothing, just waited. "What we did, what I encouraged, was inexcusable," Greg continued. "I've been thinking a lot about why. About what made me think I deserved special treatment, that rules didn't apply to me." He looked down at his hands. "My family is moving tomorrow. Lisa and I are divorcing. Tyler's coming with me to my parents' farm upstate. I think the space and physical work will be good for him." "I hope so," Michael said simply. "He talks about you, you know, about what you've taught him at the Veterans Center, about respect and consequences." Greg looked up, meeting Michael's eyes directly. "Thank you for giving my son a chance to learn from this." I know you didn't have to do that." They didn't shake hands, but something passed between them, an acknowledgement that while some damage couldn't be undone, moving forward was still possible. Later that evening, as the sun set, Michael took the Mustang for one last drive around town before heading to his new home. He drove past Dave's auto shop, closed now for the day but the site of so much healing, past the Veterans Center where he now led a weekly support group, past the courthouse where justice had been served. At a stoplight, a car pulled up beside him, a young couple who waved appreciatively at the Mustang. "Beautiful car," the driver called out. "Is it a 67? "Yes," Michael replied with a smile. "It has quite a story." The light changed, and Michael accelerated gently, enjoying the rumble of the engine. In his rearview mirror, Pine Ridge Apartments grew smaller. Ahead lay a different future than the one he'd imagined when he first came home from his tours. It was better in some ways, harder in others, but undeniably his own. On the passenger seat lay a framed photo of his father standing proudly beside the Mustang decades ago. Next to it was a leather-bound journal where Michael had begun writing down his experiences, the bad and the good, the pain and the healing. The first page started with words his father had often repeated. "It's not what happens to you that matters most. It's how you respond and who stands beside you when you do." As Michael turned onto the highway, he rolled down the windows and let the evening air rush in. The Mustang responded eagerly, carrying him forward into whatever came next. Behind him, the sun set on one chapter. Ahead, the road opened wide with possibility.